My fellow bad guys, I, Lex Luthor, your leader, will speak now about my, Lex Luthor's plan. My villainous plan. Question the plan at your peril.
So have you heard any good rumors about DC Comics lately? Apparently this article from Bleeding Cool's got everybody talking about DC Comics and what's the future of the publishing division. Now, I've read the article. Hadn't really planned on making a video about it because, I don't know, there's a lot of speculation in there. Not a lot of things you can actually verify. Although there is some information. I don't know. If you read it, did you come away thinking, wow, this is a really well-constructed idea of how things are working? It felt like Rich Johnson just put a bunch of information in there from different various sources, and they kind of contradicted each other. I was like, well, there's the one rumor. I imagine everyone's going to talk about that. But I'm seeing enough feedback from the viewers that I guess I should probably get into it, give them my thoughts with a little bit of the information that I do know. And I broke it down. Like, we'll talk about, obviously, the main rumor that there's a group of super fans that have access to tens of millions of dollars that are going to pool their money together, buy DC Comics, and start publishing DC Comics the way they want to. And then some of the other information that was kind of backup and supporting data. Now, before I get into the details of this rumor and my thoughts on it, I do want to say, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, give me a thumbs up if you enjoy this, give me a thumbs down if you don't. Either way, I definitely want to hear your thoughts. Do you think there's a group of DC super fans that are ready to put out a lot of money? We'll get into that here in a second, to purchase the publishing rights for DC Comics without any of the other benefits, like movies and stuff like that. Now let's get into the big rumor, and this was at the very bottom of the article. You'd think you'd lead with the story. Last year, a number of high-rolling individuals were given tours of DC Comics Burbank with at&t Warner officials. As a result, there may be some new options, because Bleeding Cool has been made aware of plans by big-time DC Comics fans with access to a lot of money, many millions from across many businesses, not to buy DC Comics outright from at&t Warner's, not to touch the movies, the TV, the games, or the merchandise. All the stuff that generates a lot of money. All the stuff that generates money. But solely the rights and ownership of the comic book side of the publisher to be able to create and publish the DC Comics line as they would like. Now, there have been plenty of people within the industry that have come out in support of this and said they've heard about it. Rob Liefeld has said he's heard it. Jimmy Palmiotti said he's heard it. I think EVS said he knows who it is, and that it's going to happen, maybe. Now, would Time Warner and at&t be open to selling DC Comics, like the publishing rights, just outright? Yeah, I mean, I guess $1 Million Man said it right. Everyone's got a price. But, I think it would be, there's probably a lot more to it. I know there's a lot of weird publishing agreements. I think Perch kind of went into that on his video talking about it. But also, there's just the sheer price. So I know most valuations on businesses. Now, there's multiple ways that you can evaluate businesses, but one of the first ones you go to is revenue. I believe the estimates are of 2019 DC comic books publishing, the comic company generated $300 million. The general rule of thumb, I believe, is like 1.5 times revenue. As long as your business hasn't been losing money, is kind of like the general valuation given to a lot of businesses. $300 million, 1.5. You're close to $500 million, $500 million. Now that would take a lot of cheddar. Obviously, if you do have some deep-pocketed DC Comics fans that want to pull their resources together and get an offer in there, I imagine if they got enough cash together, they could probably go out there and get access to that kind of money. But that would be a big leap of faith. I thought the print industry was dying. Well, maybe not so fast, but I don't know. Where's the real money in comic books? Where do we see all these independent comic publishers moving towards? Are they moving towards to having the best shared comic universes, or are they trying to, or do a lot of comic books feel like test runs for Netflix or test runs for movie franchises, because that's kind of where the major money is generated from comic books these days. Would you want to invest $500 million into acquiring the rights to a property that you couldn't make a movie on? You couldn't, make a TV show on. You couldn't even pitch one. So I think that would be a big constraint on going out and buying them, and just like the merchandising, just the DC Comics merchandising alone that's generated just by putting their name on stuff absolutely dwarfs the entire comic book industry. And AT&T and Time Warner certainly aren't going to be giving that up. That's a cash cow. They don't even really have to do anything. They just have to go and meet with people and take the best offer to put those things on there. Now, do I want this to happen? Do I want a bunch of do I want Ben Affleck, who's reported enormous Batman fan, and Nick Cage, a big Superman fan, to get their friends together and pull something together and like put somebody like Jim Shooter in charge and put the most kick-ass DC Comics line you've ever seen? Absolutely, that would be great. But I do think it's a lot more complicated. The money that would be needed to purchase it would be quite substantial. It would be a big investment on their parts. And just because people are inquiring doesn't mean that we're anywhere near these things happening. People kick the tires on properties all the time. Just because someone calls the Kansas City Chiefs about Patrick Mahomes doesn't mean they're ready to trade him or even willing to. Everyone's willing to listen. And I do think Dinesh Shamdasani, who has some experience with this kind of stuff, obviously he went and bought Valiant Comics when they've been destroyed by Acclaim, hadn't been published in years, went and bought them because he was a fan, because he had enough money. And he essentially ended up relaunching the line. He's a super fan, ended up being really good. But he's done something similar to this. And this is what he had to say about the idea of a bunch of fans buying the publishing rights for DC Comics. Not licensing, buying them outright, as in they own them. This is something different. This is DC trying to get rich fans to bankroll the losses of publishing while Warner keeps everything. So superfan Dinesh Shamdasani, who went and did something essentially exactly like this, he's pretty skeptical. He said, that's a pretty stupid idea. You're not getting any of the stuff that's really valuable, potentially in the long term. If there was a group of people doing this, I kind of would have expected Dinesh to be a part of it, to be completely honest. Now, there was some other information that came out of this. One of the claims was one of the reasons DC Comics wasn't as profitable as they should be was former DC President Diane Nelson's decision to move DC Comics from relatively expensive offices in Manhattan to insanely expensive offices in Burbank was a really big factor in all the layoffs and everything, and why DC Comics had to get rid of like their editorial. That's pretty false. Did you see what happened at Warner Media? They laid off people in every single division, except for, I think, HBO Max. Everybody had enormous layoffs. Some had bigger layoffs than DC Comics. Now, did DC moving to Burbank add more expenses? Sure. But if DC had stayed in Manhattan, they still would have wiped all those people out and laid them off, because the pandemic still would have happened. And Warner Media's launch of HBO Max still would have been lackluster. And they still had to lay off all these people. The DC editorial layoffs, like maybe a tiny fraction of that had to do with Diane Nelson. And I don't even think that was her decision, but I think she is the one that finally signed off on it in the end, moving the offices from Manhattan to Burbank. And I'll agree with like the premise that nothing really valuable was gained. But the fact that played a role in the layoffs is patently ridiculous. Now, it might have added like a little pimple on the ass of Warner Media and AT&T's expenses, but it certainly didn't account for that. Was a ridiculous idea in there. And this is kind of what they've been hearing about the current financial state of DC Comics. From Future State to Infinite Frontier, sales per title are up, almost guaranteed. The line is smaller with fewer editorial staff. It has to be. But per title, per allocated desk space in that empty Burbank building, profitability is up. It also helps that some rather pricey exclusive creators deals are also a thing of the past as well. Yes, they're almost guaranteed to be at this moment more profitable than they were 3 months ago. They got rid of all the DC exclusive creators. A lot of the big titles in Future State are severely expensive. The Batman title is like $8. I think the big Superman title is also $8. The backup Batman title is $6. The backup Superman title is $6. There's a few of those $6 titles in there. So it's not like these are expensive comics. They did shrink the line. They got rid of essentially all the underperformers because these are all kind of new titles. A lot of Batman related stuff. You had a pretty minute line, so big time DC fans had less stuff to look at. So obviously they were purchasing more of what was available. Guaranteed to be more profitable at this very moment in time. What does that mean for the future? We shall see. This was interesting. There's some suspicion that everything is resting on Infinite Frontier's performance as to whether or not DC Comics continues to have a serialized print comic publishing line. That would be news to me. And I do have several sources. Well, not several. I have a couple of sources that I've talked to kind of in depth about this. And they have plans to be publishing in the extended, like, they're not stopping in June, I'll tell you that. They're certainly not stopping in 2021. Does all hope rest on Infinite Frontier, whether DC Comics will continue to publish comic books? I don't know. I guess if everything bombs and they go in the red so bad that it becomes a burden on Warner Media and at&t. So I guess in that respect, maybe that's true. But I don't. This isn't coming from. I'm pretty sure this isn't coming from like the actual executives and the people managing DC Comics. This is probably just wanton speculation from maybe some people that were fired recently, or just people that are really worried about their job, and they should be, because there's supposedly we might have a third round of firings coming. But this is the bottom line. But as it stands, things are very good, better than they have been at DC for some time. How the hell would they know? We're 6 weeks into Infinite or for Future State. We haven't published a single comic for Infinite Frontier. Obviously, they have initial sales, but when they relaunched New 52, they outsold. They were the #1 comic publisher in the entire industry for months. When they relaunched Rebirth, they were the #1 publisher as far as market share for months. There are no indications that DC Comics is going to be the market share leader when Infinite Frontier launches. And we might never even know because they have different distribution than the Diamond Comics. Are sales up per title? Absolutely. Are DC more profitable in this very moment? Absolutely. But I guarantee you, if you go to the accounting office, like at Warner, and go, hey, how's DC's long-term outlook look? And they're like, how the hell would I know? We haven't even launched Infinite Frontier. We've got the initial sales, the first few issues. If everybody rejects it after 2 issues, we'll know then. They don't know. So at this very moment, are things better? Yes. Do they have any idea about their long-term outlook? Absolutely not. Nobody does. Nobody knows what it's going to look like. Future sales were better than anticipated. They were anticipated to be abysmal. They were better than abysmal. DC Comics is planning to reduce serialized print publication, increase digital publication, and license comic book publication to other publishers. We've heard Marvel, IDW, Dynamite, and other have all approached DC, but the prices were too high. But Penguin Random House, was willing to pay. They have an agreement. We've heard this one for so long. DC Comics are going to start licensing out their characters. Well, obviously to a small degree, like Marvel has done. Marvel has licensed out a very small line over IDW for like kids-oriented comic books. I'm sure DC has looked into that as well. Do I think Marvel came over and said, hey, we'd like to pay to publish Batman? No, that's ridiculous. Now, did IDW? I bet absolutely. They're in the licensing business. Did Dynamite? I'm sure they did. Dynamite does license comic book properties. But this idea that DC is just going to shut down and just license out their characters and the money is just going to roll in. It's a good idea. It's a good premise. And I'm sure they would love to do it. Who would do it? Who's going to take on DC's 50 or 60 new comic books that they would stop publishing? All right, what are they going to do? They're gonna, okay, IDW, you're going to get 5 of the Batman books. Dynamite, you're going to get 3. We'll give Marvel the Superman line. Like, there's not, none of those companies are prepared to even do that. And the only one that probably would be even close is Image, but the way that they work precludes them from doing it. So I'm sure that they have looked into licensing. I don't believe Marvel made any real looks into that. What are they going to do? Take their top writers off of their Marvel properties that they want to develop into Marvel movies and Marvel TV shows and put them on DC stuff so Warner Media can go and take those stories and make money off of them? No, they're direct competitors. And now the last thing, this one came from like their response article when they were like patting themselves on the back because Rob Liefeld and Jimmy Palmiotti said they'd heard this rumor too. They said, and this contradicts kind of what they were just talking about, but it does make sense. A proposed move to digital first publication over print publication is getting knocked back after the digital numbers have remained disappointing even during the lockdown. It turns out the remaining print audience has made their decision of print versus digital some time ago and are happy to wait for the ink to hit the paper. Even in pandemic, digital comic sales did not get a bump. I absolutely believe this. And I do. It appears DC is absolutely rethinking their digital comic strategy. They went out guns blazing on all these DC digital first comics, right? And they're still releasing them. But guess what? They're changing them. Every 2 digital comics, you get a print comic. People don't want to buy individual digital comics. If you make an individual purchase, you want to own something. When it comes to digital, you don't. Unless they're going to give me the PDF, in which case it's going to get pirated even more than it is already. So they're not going to do that. So this idea that you can get the digital comic market booming on individual comic sales is balderdash. We've been saying that on the channel for over a year now. The future of digital comics is subscription services. People don't want to feel like they own a digital product. They want to have access to a digital library, like Netflix, like Pandora, like Spotify, like all that stuff. This stuff has already been figured out across the board. Until DC Comics fully invest in their digital line and Marvel Comics fully invest in their digital line. And by fully invest, I mean they start putting their new comics, their Spider-Man and their Batman and all the stuff they've invested in, available in their subscription for services day of, they're never going to get anywhere. Somebody will figure this out. Everyone's already figured out, but DC and Marvel will eventually get their heads out of their butts, figure this out, and it will get solved at some point. I imagine by the end of the year that I believe the lead time is 90 days at DC and Marvel. New comics show up 90 days after publication. It's got to be down to 30 days or less by the end of the year. If they want to get digital, be serious about digital, it has to be subscription model. That's where the future is. Individual comic sales, they're just not going anywhere. When do you buy digital comics? I buy mine from Comixology when it's the $2.99 sale, when I can get something that's a $30 trade for $3. Otherwise, I'll buy it in physical. I'm assuming that's how everyone else does it. I'm not buying that comic for regular prices digital. I will buy it when it's 10 cents. And that's why subscriptions services are the future. Now, what do you guys think? Is there a group of DC super fans out there just waiting to buy up the rights to publish DC comics? Have they generated the necessary hundreds of millions of dollars to get this together? Or do you think this is some pie in the sky? Sure, people have inquired, but it would take a lot of money. There's a lot of things that you're not getting that you would want to if you were investing all of your time and money in developing these stories. You'd want the rights to the movies and stuff like that. So there's a lot of things they would have to work out. Plus, from what I understand, the publishing rights for a lot of DC characters is an absolute nightmare that they would actually have to go and work all that stuff out. Would you want to buy the publishing rights to DC Comics if you didn't get maybe 5 or 6 of their key characters in there? That would suck. And that might just be the way that it is. Plus, I'm not going to get even. There's even more to it than that. But those are my thoughts on these rumors going out there and a lot of the weird supporting details that Rich Johnson over at Bleeding Cool put together. Not a very well constructed article. There was some interesting information. I tried to break it down the best I could and talk about it.